Colleagues, to our seminar number 183, and our topic today is, do contemporary societies need universities? A question that we sometimes ask and we should ask more often. And to open up that question today, we have Christopher Newfield. Now, Chris is the Director of Research at the Independent Social Research Foundation and Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And his areas of research are critical university studies, critical theory, quantification studies, the intellectual and social effects of the humanities, and US cultural history before the Civil War and after World War II. And many of you, I think, will be familiar with his work. His writing is well known and widely read. He's widely read and widely reviewed. One of the most important critical scholars on higher education in the world now, I think. So we're very pleased to have him in our webinar today, and the number of people who've registered for today's webinar indicates the interest in his contribution. Before I hand over to him, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded today and will be posted online on the CG website within 48 hours or so, and that means it goes to YouTube as well, and we're finding that the YouTube recognition of our webinars is often greater than the number who tune in on the day. A transcript of today's chat function will also be posted. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or you're asking your question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but it's good if you can turn it on when you come to the point of asking a question or making a statement. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. Now, we compose the Q&A part of our webinar, which is an important part, through the chat function. So write your question out, insert it into chat, and I will select the Q&A contributors on the basis of what's appearing in chat. It's a good idea to raise your question early. Some of our best questions come in the last 10 minutes, last 5 minutes, and we can't fit them in. So, you know, if Chris triggers some thoughts, put them down immediately and put them into chat and raise your question that way. When we get to the Q&A section of the program, when you're invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Christopher Newfield, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Simon. I'm really very glad to be here. I'm going to share the screen and then load this up. Okay. How's that look?
Yes, it's there.
All right. We're kind of stuck between stations in higher education, and we can't go back to a kind of a social democracy understanding of what the university is, at least, you know, in terms of the sort of the political and economic structures that support that. But it doesn't seem like we can really move forward either. The future is opaque. We're stuck in the middle of sort of in between two paradigms. And one of the problems with this place that we're stuck in is that we have a funding model and a sense of social prospects or social benefits or obligations for higher education that don't really fit together. The funding model isn't working as advertised, and the social benefits are clunky at best. We've generated over the last 20 or 30 years, in part, I think, in a sincere effort to please policymakers and ruling orthodoxies and what we see to be the public. We've actually created quite a bit of a political and public enmity. The other thing that seems to be going on that's related to this is a split between policy and research understandings of what is and is not working. So in research, there's been quite a bit of critique of various aspects of what we might sort of loosely call a neoliberal model. And at the same time, as it continues to be policy orthodoxy, at least in the English-speaking countries, the US and the UK being particularly obvious examples. So what I would like to do today is talk about how to get out of this particular stuck position, this in-between place. And I like to do it also with COVID in mind. I mean, COVID, I think, is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's encouraging the policy world to double down on the familiar solutions that we already have, but they're not really working that well, but they're the, it's the devil we know. That is more commercialization of knowledge, more focus on courses that lead directly to paid employment, elimination of courses that don't obviously do that, and so on. And on the other hand, what COVID has revealed is market failure, right? Is the difficulty of getting the social ends that you want with something approximating a sort of a neoliberal state. So one example from the public health world is that when you outsource your test and tracing program, you get terrible testing and tracing, which then has all sorts of downstream implications on whether people are able to recover and go about their daily lives. So it's an interestingly fluid situation. I'm going to try to get us to a couple of strategies that I've been working on that I think might help. Okay, so let's start with the sort of the policy orthodoxy that we're familiar with, and that is that college is essentially a private pecuniary benefit, right? It's about increasing your own wages. This is a slide from a major public research university in the US, Ohio State. A very well-intentioned education professor, Matt Mayhew, published a book as he arrived at this institution and discovered about a week later that the results had been pulled into the marketing machine of the university in this way. So the claim here is that you should go to college in general, and you should go to Ohio State in particular, because it's a very large positive return on your personal investment. So here we have direct and indirect costs. You have to pay for tuition and other forms of the total cost of attendance, but you get back a lot more than you put in. So although you're intimidated by the upfront cost and the loans that you're taking out and the debt that you're incurring and the debt that your parents are probably taking on, it doesn't matter because you have a massive ROI. The big upside in the future is 12 to 14%, which is it's a lot more than you're getting in your savings account. So there's that kind of a push towards this one type of benefit. The one person I know who's tried to quantify all of the different types of benefits has found that it's really only about a third or most a half of the total benefits, non-monetary and monetary. Nonetheless, it's the one that higher education leaders, policymakers have told the public is the main benefit. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, a kind of a miseducation of the public that we've been engaged in for quite a while. Okay, so here's a kind of standard way of, visually unfriendly way of presenting this. It's just a kind of a 2x2 that economists generate. You have pecuniary or monetary benefits in the top row. You have non-pecuniary benefits in the bottom row. You have the private and the public, or sometimes called external, or the private and the social. These terms kind of move around. And basically everything is crowded in the standard accounting into this one quadrant, and these other ones are essentially blank for most forms of public consumption. Okay, everybody dislikes this, in theory at least, this particular representation. Most policy folks feel trapped in it, but there's been a little bit of wiggle room created in the last, 10 or so years. And depending on which party you're in, you've used this more or less. And an example of that wiggle room comes from the governor of the state that sees itself as the world's knowledge economy par excellence, which is California. This is an official Department of Finance text, and it's Newsom explaining the purpose of college or university, which is for the state to meet ever-changing workforce needs, for individuals to improve their upward economic mobility, and also there's a social dimension to do this for racial minority majority population, right? So 75% of secondary school students in California are students of color. And so Newsom is nodding to this reality and suggesting that higher education will turn this into a benefit for the state. And when you modify this chart, you get something that looks like that. So these are still dominant, right? But you have others that are at least visible as part of the discourse. And I'm putting question marks here because it's not clear to me that mainstream policymakers, including Democrats or labor folks, really believe in a causal connection between a generic university degree on the one hand and national benefit, economic benefits on the other. I mean, Andrew McGettigan has been talking about this for the last few years. As your attainment levels go up, your productivity rates don't necessarily go up. I mean, that's kind of been the British story of the 2010s. So skepticism has crept into this. But the problem with this particular structure is that although it admits the other types of benefits, social and also non-pecuniary and non-monetary, and although there's quite a bit of political purchase for some of these, social mobility is the new wage gains in the US coming out of Raj Chetty's shop at Harvard, which has gotten pipelined directly into the New York Times. So there's a lot of discussion about this. They're still seen as basically spillovers from the primary source of benefit, which is the private monetary, the private pecuniary. So what this means is that they don't necessarily deserve direct investment. That is, it's not obvious that you need to give the money directly to the institution, and the US and now the UK since 2011 or so gives most of its federal money to two groups, either to researchers on the one hand or for operations to students in the form of financial aid. And that's increasingly true in California, where a chunk of what used to be general funds going to the institution is now going to backfill tuition increases in the form of what are called Cal Grants, which is basically financial aid for students that can't afford to keep up with all of the tuition increases that the university was using in order to make up for the cuts from the public side. You can see sort of how this creates a downward spiral. So the basic frame I'm suggesting isn't that different from Milton Friedman's original sort of 1955 model, in which, in order to avoid massive inefficiencies, the money has to go through individuals. You don't want to pay institutions to do things that institutions want to do. It has to maintain it has to be a private monetary kind of thing. So there's all sorts of downsides to this. And in the policy world, there's been a fair amount of critiquing of this, to put it politely. And there's a number of different kinds of critique that have been going forward. There's a lot of sort of political theory critique. I mean, Wendy Brown is someone who's been attacking, sort of human capital theory and neoliberalism writ large as anti-democratic. There are folks that critique Anglo-American liberal individualism as defining freedom entirely through property ownership and routing resources always through individuals, so the collective goods are essentially invisible, et cetera. But the one I think has been the strongest in terms of the enabling theory of higher ed, and which has really been developed quite a bit over the last 10 years, building on work going back even longer than that, is the critique of human capital theory. Okay, just to define this for folks that aren't entirely familiar with this bizarre but somewhat, completely influential understanding of both human nature and economies, it essentially argues that individual knowledge and skill accounts for much of the productive superiority of advanced so-called economies. So people, what happens is that people invest in their skills, and this creates a kind of capital or human capital that is analogous to capital proper, and that it increases the productivity of their labor, which then leads to higher personal wages. So the incentive for individuals, and of course in this model, they're always trying to incentivize individuals and not whole societies. It gives you reason to invest in Ohio State University, right, and getting a diploma from there. And then it also produces greater national wealth as everybody's productivity rises. Okay, so that there's a lot to say about the theory, and then, but I'm just going to say a couple of things about the critique. I'm not going to march through this whole list. This is just to show that there's a lot of quite effective arguments. 7 is a partial list, but the key, I think, are just for our purposes, the first and the last. The first is that to say that learning equals earning is only true for some people some of the time, and true for fewer people now than was the case before. So there's been some good work on showing that it's kind of a golden age, sort of 1945 to 1975 theory that worked well when there were fewer people with BAs, and when what Galbraith used to call the technostructure was hiring generic bachelor's degrees by, you know, the hundreds of thousands a year to funnel into these gigantic private bureaucracies as well as public ones. But that it basically isn't true. There's a lot of bad things that it does here in the middle of this list to the society, including locking in, not dealing with, and or intensifying inequality by race and ethnicity. And then just to skip to this last one, it also has done kind of 2 bad things, one to the university and one to society. The bad thing it's done to the university is it's put it on the hook for producing labor market effects that only labor markets control, that is wages. So it's, you know, it actually, it's taught society to blame the wrong people, sort of university administrators and professors who like to teach philosophy and art history instead of computer science, being in some ways the origin of a post-industrial, post-Lewis turning point kind of economic situation that we're in. And then the other thing that it's done is it's disincentivized even kind of center-left governments like Clinton's in the 90s and Blair's later in the 90s from developing what those kind of governments used to be good for, which was industrial policy. So instead of having an industrial policy in which you actually, you know, figure out how to maintain, say, the employment base for your blue-collar industrial workforce, instead of just offshoring it and letting those communities implode, which is more or less what we've done, you instead just put all of your eggs in the education basket. Sorry for the mixed metaphor. So Clinton and then Obama, when he came in later, which is kind of an extension of Clintonism, had very much a human capital understanding of how to make deindustrialized economies thrive again, and also how to keep the country ahead of everyone else, which was basically just to make it better educated and everything else to take care of itself. It's really kind of an odd form of laissez-faire. Okay, so you look at this formidable list and the formidable scholars that are in small print underneath, you think, okay, so the scholars must be winning and we must be really succeeding at this point in history and shifting the politicians away from this model. And in fact, that's not at all true. We haven't been very successful. And the policy world is pretty much sticking with stuff that has been kind of taken apart by a lot of people and not put back together something that that works. And so there are a lot of reasons for this, but the one that I want to feature here has to do with the convenience, the political comfort zone that this particular model exists in. And a good way of illustrating this is with Simon Marginson's chart from Higher Education and the Common Good. The last quadrants, I apologize for the multiplication of the quadrant structure. That first one was talking about types of goods. This one reflects kinds of political arrangements or political economies that you can have in order to deliver those goods. Okay, so It's a different thing. And I'm not gonna go through it all. I'm just gonna say a couple of quick things and then focus on quadrant 3. This was quadrant 2, or social democracy, where basically it's a public good and it's publicly funded, where it is health and education and a lot of things, has been in abeyance, at least in the Anglophone world, for 40 years or so. We've seen the elevation or the veneration of quadrant 4, which is the marketization of essentially everything. And there's a kind of a common sense in most of these countries that production and productivity and value creation all happen in the private sector, and the public sector doesn't really do any of that. So what the public sector does is provide a safety net, which is the world's worst metaphor for what governments actually do. And all of the other stuff in terms of national wealth and personal economic security and so on, that's the private sector that does that. And the one hand, we know it's not exactly true, but nonetheless, the ideal is that everything be there because it will be more efficient. So what we're left with is this third quadrant, which is kind of a compromise between 2 and 4, at least as I see it. And the way that I've written about it is, and it's not a term I invented, is sort of halfway privatization, right? Where you depend on public funding as your base for operations, but you focus your creative attention and also your public relations very much on the private revenue stream. So it's philanthropy in the United States. It's individually garnered research revenues through competitive grants, which is a big deal as well. The benefit of this quadrant for policymakers and for academic executives and administrators is that it's best of both worlds from the PR side. So you can say, we have introduced market efficiencies into higher education in order to produce, for example, racial equity. So we're doing our social goals, our public good goals, and our private good goals at the same time. We're serving the corporate world, we're having impact on economic growth, and yet at the same time, we are destigmatizing populations that have been oppressed unfairly and bringing them in ways that satisfy everyone's understanding of equity. So I think of this as a kind of it's like a Goldilocks quadrant for administrators. And I think this has made the human capital theory system more stable than it would be otherwise. If it were actually costing either politicians or higher education leaders something in order to maintain. Okay, so we're back to this question. So what do we do now? Human capital theory critique has to continue, and it will. So it's nothing I'm saying here should be construed as setting that aside. I think it's essential. But there are a couple of things I think that can also be done, or at least that I've been doing, to try to destabilize quadrant 3 and move us into an updated version, I think, really finally, of quadrant 2. So one thing is to say that quadrant 3 is actually a financial disaster for the university itself. And I've done a lot of work on this. This is University of California stuff where I know the budget structure quite well. This blue line is basically state per capita personal income, which just shows the amount of money that the state's population has in its pockets in order to pay for particular kinds of goods. And this is what that's the money that goes to the University of California, just one of the 3 segments expressed in the same terms. And what you can see is basically for the last 20 years, is just the gap has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So at this point, we're getting essentially half of what we had gotten at the beginning of the century. And this little bump here shows you the scale of the efforts on the part of the Office of the President budget people to increase and to get back to something like what the original trend had been during the proverbial master plans or golden age period of high quality funding. And as you can see, it's just, the ask is tiny and it's usually cut. And this year it was cut to 1/5 of what the ask was. So the trend is never to get back here. Okay, so in the private structure or the halfway privatized model, the retort to a slide like this is always, but we have all these private revenue streams and you're leaving those out. So what you're leaving out in particular is tuition and also philanthropy and also extramural funding, as though that were net positive, which it is not. And so additional calculations show that is also not true. Sorry, here's your red and your blue line again. The situation is actually quite a bit worse than that blue benchmark suggests, because this is the benchmark corrected for actual enrollment growth. So if you see we're going to get today what it got in 2000, it would be getting 10 billion instead of barely 4. And then if you throw in net tuition, that is the gross figure that the state always talks about, then subtract financial aid, subtract stuff the state doesn't pay for anymore but used to, particularly pension, employer contribution, and capital projects, so building the physical plant for a continuously growing population. What you get is this green line, which is uncomfortably close to the red one. In other words, when you net out new costs, what you get is something like what you had before, just with state funding and pretty low tuition. So it's kind of worse of both worlds. The university doesn't have all the extra money it thought it was going to get, and students are paying through the nose and going into debt, as well as their families. And the political confidence in the system is, heading towards closer to zero with every passing year. Okay, so done a fair amount of this kind of, materialist critique of the institutional conditions that are set up by quadrant 3, right? So instead of it being the Goldilocks place for more than just a few people in the policy zone, it's actually the place of decline of all sorts of stuff. Here's another thing that's quite important. Okay, we have less money, but we're still doing really well with our social causes. And what this shows is that as the share of the student population that was white, non-Hispanic, Anglo at the University of California declined, so did the university's share of state personal income. So it's almost, except for the big disaster, the financial crisis in the middle where it fell even faster, what you see is essentially a lockstep decline of white share and taxpayer funding, which is, of course, a textbook definition of systemic racism, as we once again learned to call it, in the United States in 2020. I wrote a whole book that argues that this is the original sin. Okay, there's lots of causal directions going on, so it's not just this one thing. But for the sake of clarification, I created this heuristic, which basically universities, in a friendly way, adapt to Reagan, Clinton, Thatcher, Blair understandings of the primacy of the private sector, even if there were differences about how much of the public you still needed to have. And then all the bad stuff happens, and you can't stop the bad stuff from happening unless you fix this. And that's basically the argument of the book. So you have to increase tuition, which will inevitably cause states to cut you, which will inevitably increase student debt in order to cover the increased tuition, which will indeed force you to save cost on instruction, which will adjunctify and precarize your workforce, your instructional workforce, and also increasingly your research workforce, which leads to increasing inequality in the overall sector, so that more and more low-income students, first-generation students, students of color are going to poorer and poorer universities with worse outcomes, which leads to a form of capitalism in which your investment in your human capital doesn't actually pay off for you, and society decides, well, we tried that and look, it's not working. And you have the potential for a kind of, I don't want to overstate the danger, but there is a bit of a plantation economy kind of thing going on, even in places like California, with a very large billionaire class and a very large precarious working class, working often increasingly in an informal sector that is growing. Okay, so that's, I think, one strategy, which is delegitimation. The sort of the policy world, the journalism world, the managerial world busily re-legitimizes this start every morning when they get up, right? And if the argument is there is no alternative, or this is the most efficient, or we are actually improving educational outcomes, et cetera. And so one response to this is just to say, no, if you actually look at the material conditions, if you look what's going on with the institutions, if you're an English professor and you know how to add and subtract, you can in fact show that it's not the Goldilocks quadrant. It's actually damaging those institutions themselves. And so the way that I thought this would work, and we can talk later about whether it is actually working this way, is to say the Goldilocks quadrant leads to your illness and death, not just of your students. Like, let's say that you think it's fine for them to be indebted. We're talking about your research funds and your facilities and your ability to track extramural grants, et cetera. Your ability to continue to get donor dollars by saying we're the best university in the world. So that's the first strategy, but I think it's only a piece of the story, or the piece of, I don't know, the policy solution or the intervention that I'm suggesting we need to involve ourselves in. So this is the second one that I'm going to end with, and that is to not just in a friendly way say, and there are also social benefits, and there are also non-pecuniary benefits, and sort of politely say, well, there are these other three quadrants that you're forgetting, but to, in a pretty militant way, insist on their absolutely fundamental importance, and I would even say priority to private pecuniary. Oh, what a terrible Freudian slip. So this, I think, is also going to involve bringing back in, I know it's going to involve non-STEM, non-technical, non-computer science, non-robotics kinds of knowledge. So, the arts, the social sciences, the humanities, which are the places where this, legitimation capacity is most developed. And what I'm going to do now is just show you a couple of things that suggest that this isn't a speculative discourse that we have to invent from whole cloth, but it actually is a long tradition within the university that we can upgrade, modernize, adapt, and improve. So here's just sort of 4 moments in this history. And this is what I'm calling them. This was the morning's invention, socio-individual effects. Tell me later if you hope that no one ever uses this word again. It's important that it's non-dualist, right? So that public and private are not separated out in the way that the sort of what we now call the neoliberal tradition is done. And that the two kind of are co-generated together. So 1790s, the King of Prussia is trying to eliminate the university and replace it with professionalizing vocational schools, right? Not for the last time. And so there's philosophy of what higher education is as opposed to primary and secondary develops in a way that has a lot of elements that are still quite useful. And one is that non-dualistic relationship between cognitive gain, right? Between learning on the one hand and self-formation on the other. So this idea, oh, you're going to college for personal growth? Well, I don't want to pay for that, is a fundamental sort of psychological as well as philosophical mistake, because unless you are going to college in some ways for personal growth, you are not actually going to be able to go to university to learn, right? So there's a cognitive psychology now is kind of revalidating all of this in a sort of biologistic way, but the basic insight is not new. It's well over 200 years old. There's a sense in this philosophy that the destiny of the individual is fundamentally linked to the destiny of humankind. So there's a nasty nationalist aspect to this, but there's also a universalist understanding that knowledge has to be spread throughout the population eventually, one way or another. And then finally, none of this is going to happen if your day is preoccupied with survival on the monetary side. So there has to be a separation or liberation and emancipation of the learning process and the development of non-pecuniary benefits from the pecuniary, which is, primitivizes us if we allow it. 60 years later, the US Moral Act is absolutely a settler colonial project that perpetuates native genocide rather than reversing it or enlightening it in some meaningful way. Within this kind of colonial structure is a kernel of democratic value, which is that when you go to Iowa and you go to Kansas and you go to these places where there isn't really a society in the Western sense for the settlers, you bring knowledge that includes everyone. So there's subjects, any subject that anyone wants to take has to be taught. The government does not get to decide what a legitimate subject is the public pays for, the public decides what's paid for. And it also develops an extension model, which is excessively identified with agricultural work, but which could also, and has been used, getting to the next point, in urban areas and other kinds of communities to bring knowledge into communities as the general problem-solving support device, rather than as a separate campus kind of thing that is just for special people over here, which of course the general public kind of hates. Third moment, 100 years later, the Black Studies movement, which grows out of the Civil Rights Movement, out of Black Power and out of Black Panthers, initially in Oakland, to develop community programs. So there's two aspects, or there's two institutional components of the project of sort of decentering knowledge or de-ethno-Eurocentering knowledge, decolonizing, as we would now say, Eurocentric knowledge. And that is, you need freestanding departments that are self-governing. So you have African-American studies departments or Black studies departments or Latinx departments, so that it's not just one Latinx person being governed by a essentially white history faculty with all of those epistemological traditions. So there's an epistemological change that has a material institutional basis, and the two things have to go together. And it's again modeled on, but also reflexing back to the understanding of community learning centers and kind of potentially kind of storefront, church-front universities, in which the barrier between higher education and the public is essentially broken down. And then finally, critical theory. A lot of us in the US, at least, were raised on Foucault as a kind of a cynic about the impossibility of overcoming power because it's so embedded in governance and so embedded in all forms of relations. The way that he's been used more recently is kind of the opposite. And this is a Judith Butler refunctioning of some things that Foucault said in the 70s around critique. And that is critique as a space kind of in the humanities between, say, literary history on the one hand, philosophy, et cetera, is on the one hand a way of refusing subordination to an established authority. That is, it's a way of always being able to critique the claims to foundational authority on the part of somebody who has it. And then on the other hand, an obligation to produce or elaborate a self. So in a way, there's a critical theory, as it's also been imported into queer studies, into trans studies, into a range of studies in the US and here and elsewhere, envelops, refunctions, reprocesses, and redevelops a tradition that really goes back to the Prussians, if not all the way back to the Greeks and the Chinese education. And anyway, there's a lot of other things to say about this. So I guess the point that I would want to make is that we have a solid base on which to develop this kind of work I'm just going to point to this slide and then wrap up. There's, I don't know, sort of knowledge philosophy stuff on that last slide that has important institutional and political dimensions. Another thing that has to, I think, become clearer to the public is what actually happens with university learning. It's not high school. It's not basically learning content. It's all this other stuff. And what this is just kind of my homemade list of steps for devising and performing, concluding, and then advocating for an independent research project on the part of an undergraduate student. And my ideal is that everybody that has a bachelor's degree can actually develop research knowledge. So it's creativity learning is here. It's also called research learning. It's something that mass institutions do not have the resources to do. They aren't funded for it. They don't have the personnel. They don't have the working conditions for the personnel to do this. And my thinking here is that the ideal has to get out there as an explanation for why the public funding has to follow the public purpose that can be concretized in structures like this. So there's research, social transformation on the last slide. There's individual learning, which has an indissociable social dimension on this slide. And this is all to say that there's a ton of stuff that's already available that we can use to basically escape from that 2x2 that I was showing before with the strong private pecuniary and the weak other three. So here's, I think, where I would like to end up, that we keep the critique of human capital theory, and we add to it, and this is something other people are already doing, so I'm going to say, oh, this is brand new. It's more a turning this towards kind of a vision of the positive vision of where education sits in society that I think would actually be quite popular with the general public. And for me, it has to be fundamentally anti-dualist. So it has to contest in a deep way the liberal individualism that is still the default understanding of what education is for. And it has to understand this, use this word again, maybe for the last time, the socio-individual good. And then it's going to also involve this recentering of socio-cultural knowledge as a co-equal partner with, and actually in some ways a leader of, the sort of technical knowledge to which we excessively look for the solutions to all of our problems. So I guess what I want to say is just that I think we really should do something with the non-pecuniary, and that now is quite an opportune time to do that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher Newfield. That was really convincing, I think, in many respects. And I particularly liked your two strategies and your non-dualistic socio-individual effects. I mean, very persuasive and all, fruitful lines of inquiry, past and present. And my sense of that late Foucault, the last 3 or 4 books of lectures where he goes back to the Hellenic world and works on, the question of establishing your autonomous self through the work of the self on the self, and looks at how that was done by the Stoics and others in the Hellenistic world. He sort of was looking for a way out of the very problematic that he'd created, this sort of sense of, of discipline and domination. And, there are, I think, lots of really useful suggestions there. I've got half a dozen things I wanted to ask you about, but we've got a good call list, and I'll go straight to Peter Scott at this point.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed your presentation. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but I felt the kind of solutions you come up with, aren't these things we've been trying to do for a long time already, making those kind of points? I mean, right at the start of your talk, you suggested that if we kind of accept that the kind of liberal social democratic understanding of the world has kind of irreparably been lost, and if we're stuck with a kind of, in crude terms, a kind of neoliberal view of it, can we seriously expect significant adjustments in the policy sphere to actually take place? I mean, after all, if you look back in history, I mean, many of the advances in higher education in terms of our understanding of its expansion, of its potential to emancipate individuals in a really important way, these were actually empowered to some degree because at that time, of course, there was a liberal stroke social democratic understanding of society. And that was what allowed it to happen. If we give up on that, how realistic is to expect that we can actually make any significant sort of policy adjustments? Because many of the points you make, I think, are ones that are relatively well understood within the academic and research community, and perhaps a bit more broadly in intellectual communities, but it seems to have only a marginal impact on the policy community. I mean, you did say at one point, which I quite like, that we should be a bit more militant, and I think that's right. I mean, we shouldn't give up on the fact that, you know, the way that the kind of order that allows some of these things to happen has gone forever. Maybe we need to fight back. I mean, it always strikes me, I'm not suggesting, of course, we storm the Capitol or kind of burn cars in the streets or things like that. But maybe a bit more militancy is required. I mean, I think liberals and social democrats, and we saw it in the UK, particularly over the Brexit debate, are just far too civilized about this, you know, and we're rather weak. And our opponents have been much more determined. So maybe we could show some militancy in the kind of political sphere. This would actually empower some of the things we'd like to see in our broader understanding of higher education. Sorry, that's a bit political, but.
No, I completely agree with where you ended up. And all I'm saying is that we take, as you correctly say, the knowledge that we already have within sort of academic circles and put the principles ahead of the political calculations. I mean, I think that I see this every day, you know, at the University of California, where basically the argument is tailored to acceptability with the intended or impeded audience, rather than starting with the strongest, most radical understanding of what it is that we're doing, and then advocating for that, you know, in the same way that Jamie Dimon advocates for banking, you know, when he goes to Washington. And I say this especially around academic staff, you know, faculty as we call them in the US, is we have been far too complacent, compliant, and accommodating to the point where we basically don't, you know, our strongest arguments are already weakened before they even get out there.
Thanks, Krista, and thanks, Peter. Claudine Provencher is next.
Yes, hi. Thank you for that talk. I work at the LSE, and my question is on there too many entrenched interest and lack of imagination in the academic profession for the delegitimization exercise that you mentioned to take place?
Yeah, that's a very important point, because people feel like their baby is going to get thrown out with the bath. So if we sacrifice our, you know, administrative structures, that we're going to be sacrificing ourselves at the same time. I think the only way to deal with that is with, you know, sort of full disclosure about the economic conditions that we're working with, including the cost of research. And then to just, you know, have a series of complex internal discussions in which we actually do work out where the boundaries are between the things that we are willing to give up. Some, you know, some privilege is going to be given up in a process like this, and which we're absolutely not going to, because they denature the intellectual core that we will always fight for. And my claim, based part on costing out some elements of what actual higher education requires, is that the stuff that we really care about is not that expensive and can be maintained if the educational core, you know, quality research and quality instruction is is fought for on the basis of really necessary material conditions and not just defending the whole structure. But there's going to be some very awkward conversations on the way to getting there.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Claudine. I think Diana Laurillard wanted to add to this part of the conversation.
Well, I mean, my question there was to Claudine, really, because I had the impression that the delegitimization was coming from external forces and powerful external forces as well. I mean, I think we all experience that, certainly in the media, people take every opportunity to delegitimize certain aspects of what universities are doing. Currently, scientific work in universities is being applauded from all quarters. But at the same time, we still see comments which are, let's say, at least disobliging about social science and even media. Poor old media studies came in for it with our Secretary of State recently. So there's lots of ways in which the media pushes those kinds of arguments for delegitimizing what universities are doing, and those are powerful forces. Don't we have to look out for those too, not just within the academe?
I see Chris is nodding.
What happens when there's a sort of financial precarity in a particular institution, and one of the possible solutions is taking less qualified students for a few years in order to maintain teaching revenues? That's a difficult choice, because a lot of faculty professors will say, I don't want to teach less qualified students, I'm a scholar. And if you took a vote in a given room, they would probably be pretty split. So there's one where you then have to have the discussion, the policy discussion and the values discussion to work out something that will allow continuation.
The next Q&A is from Victorita Triff. Victorita.
Hi, this is Victorita Triff from the University of Bucharest. Congratulations, Christopher, for your presentation. How to focus our attention on economic welfare in time of institutional stress?
By looking at medium and long term instead of just short term. And we can also use the current moment to talk about fundamental, sort of philosophical, intellectual structures that we want to preserve for going forward. I think, it's really a trap to focus on the short-term problem. And I say that as somebody whose entire teaching career has been punctuated by cuts. My first merit increase as an assistant professor was granted, and then the money was taken away because of 90s cuts. And we're now in the fourth round of major multi-year cuts. So, 2020, 2009, the framework has to be changed, and this is we can't focus only on the near-term problem.
Thank you very much.
The next speaker was going to be Luis Coachi, but I think Luis has dropped off the list of participants. So can I bring in David Mills?
Hi, Christopher, thanks. Really interesting. Thank you very much. Lots of provocative thoughts there. One question I have is, you seem to be sort of suggesting that actually there's quite a gap between what's going on potentially within the pedagogic possibilities and the policy discussion. Is it wise to get involved in the culture wars and insist on a sort of a whole new thinking about epistemology and pedagogy, or are universities better off not sort of getting too involved in that policy narrative and actually just reworking what they're doing? Because you present this tension between what's possible pedagogically and then what's possible in policy terms.
I think we're in the culture wars whether we want to be or not.
Okay.
And I think we have to fight them into a state of success. And the way that I've tried to deal with this is to get it sort of lower at baseline not commonalities, but baseline desires that people, even right-wing people who think that the university is trying to destroy their way of life, actually have. So when The Great Mistake first came out, I was invited mostly onto right-wing talk shows in the US. And I found that it was somewhat disarming to say, really what we're trying to do is offer the most interesting and fullest possible life to your children.
Mm.
We would also like to set up our university so you can come too as an adult. You know, it's a lifetime issue. It's not just 18 to 22. And then when you're in the class, and we can have the arguments about all the terrible things you think we're saying. First, we would like you to be there in the first place and don't judge us from a distance, et cetera. And I think that worked out pretty well. And I think it can happen too with the conservative use of you know, the statue issue here and that kind of thing that's been happening.
Great, thank you.
Thank you both. Mark Johnson. Mark. Are you there, Mark? He's still in the meeting, I think. Mark, come in when you're ready. I might ask a question while you're waiting. Chris, your point about the university retreat from public goods and the need to turn that around, if you like, very powerful point. The difficulty is how the politics of that might unfold. I mean, in these more centralized systems, we might look to the state, hopefully founding, itself in a democratic conversation in reorientating the mission and funding base of institutions. And you can point to systems where this is possible. And of course, some of them are in Western Europe. But in these more decentralized systems where responsibility has been passed back to institutions, their governing bodies and their CEOs and so on, like the UK and the US, where's the momentum going to come from? Is it going to come from lighthouse institutions doing things differently? And I think to some extent, the UC system has those institutions doing things differently in some respects, certainly in terms of access and the social mission. Or does it come from changing the collective discourse between the institutions, getting them to set aside a sort of US News and World Report view of the world and starting to collaborate on common values? Is that feasible, do you think?
I think it's necessary. I'm glad you brought that up. That's really crucial, because the positional good competition is very destructive.
Yeah.
And wasteful. And it also weakens the sector's voice. And there's a lot of confidential sort of elite back channeling discussion about how you should really continue to support us and not the rest. And this happens in the UC system with the flagships and regionals versus big city schools in the States. And I'm sure it's happening here too. So yeah, that's part of this, a much more collaborative approach within the sector towards starting with our strongest goods and not our weakest ones, or not our,
yes, starting
with our less known ones and not our best known.
So I once again say, are you there, Mark? And if not, let me take my line of question further. Now, the UC system and what's happening in California. Many of us were great admirers at different stages in our careers of the master plan. It seemed to satisfy the dual objective of creating high quality science-based universities and creating access to all. And the master plan has run its course historically, and there are problems at both top and bottom. What do you think is going to come out of this pandemic and post-pandemic period in California? Still the largest and most significant system in the world in some ways. And where is it going from here? Is there prospect of rebuilding one or both of those missions?
The default is going to be more online education, more lecturers and fewer permanent staff or fewer sort of research staff. And basically just more efficiencies in the form of less money to the educational core. And I think that it's an opportunity that we could really blow to shift the discourse around. For me, the way in is basically the systemic racism of cutting money when you have a mostly student of color school population.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a second generation a college-educated Californian. And one of the things that initially motivated my work was wanting for today's students of color exactly the same high-quality free University of California that was available for my white parents. And there are those kind of political arguments that I think we have yet to use. And there's much more that we can do than we've been doing under the more constrained discourses of the last 10 or 15 years.
But there's a voter base which potentially can be mobilized for a different policy.
Yeah, at the moment they just.
I would agree with that. I think that the University of Wisconsin created public radio and public television and created a whole outreach extension service, but we have been in decline for 10 years precisely because of the logic, the political economy logics that Christopher has outlined, and we are in deep trouble. So we might pull out of this kind of death spiral for the University of Wisconsin system and the University of UW extension, but it's going to be extremely hard, and we are struggling with deeply conservative political forces in many of the regional parts of the state. So yes, it's going to be a struggle.
On the other hand, I mean, that's totally right. But the Wisconsin plan was saved by its popularity when your governor tried to get rid of it. Right. So in other words, there's a base of interest in what universities do that I don't think we've sufficiently tapped. And it's going to vary by state and by country, how we approach that.
Yeah.
But the model that I really use is the people that I mentioned before, that Hayek and Friedman and Becker and all these people were working in the wilderness for decades as fringe people, who then, 50 years later found their ideas mainstream and then dominant. And I believe we can do exactly the same thing with, sort of progressive ideals around the social impacts of higher ed.
Yeah. But they organized, didn't they? They had the Mont Pelerin Society. They had a succession. They had the think tanks that slowly built traction over a long period. They captured the attention of a few key people. It took them, a generation, I think, really the post-Keynesian revolt was a generation in the making. And maybe we're in the throes of that now, but we can't see it exactly happening, but let's hope it is. Chris, it was really terrific contribution today. And I think the thing that really is compelling above all, it seems to me, is your refusal of the public-private dualism, which constitutes also a refusal of the individual collective dualism. And, there's a sort of really important message in that for all societies and not just the English-speaking or West European societies. It's a really significant point. And, we really hope we have you back in one way or another, and look forward to your work and reading what you're saying and joining your conversations and your discussions. Thanks, colleagues. Thanks for an excellent attendance today. It was good to see 123 people, I think I counted at one point, were tuned in, and some good contributions in the discussion and in the chat. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, and we have Rachel Brooks talking to us about European higher education students. Another excellent paper, I'm sure, out of that very fertile project that she's been working on with a group of younger presenters. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again for your attendance today. Above all, thank you, Chris. Well done, and we'll see you again, I hope. Bye for now.
Thank you.